Mom used to say, the water remembers every wish. So I keep coming back, hoping maybe one of mine will finally come true. 26-year-old Teslyn Hart whispered the words to herself as she sat in her wheelchair beside Riverside Park's fountain, sketchbook balanced on her lap, charcoal-stained fingers trembling slightly in the autumn breeze. She came here every Thursday afternoon, always alone, always to the same weathered bench beneath the oak tree where she could hear the water's gentle rhythm. It had been her mother's favorite spot before the cancer took her 3 years ago, and now it was Teslyn's refuge from a world that rarely saw past her wheels. The accident at 19, a devastating car crash that left her paralyzed from the waist down, had stolen more than her ability to walk. It had stolen her confidence, her college dreams, and most painfully, her belief that anyone would ever see her as whole. She'd withdrawn from university in her sophomore year, retreating to the small house she shared with her father and grandmother, pouring her grief and longing into art that no one but family ever saw. Her grandmother meant well, but worried constantly. Her father worked double shifts to cover medical expenses and spoke in careful, overly cheerful tones that made Teslyn feel like a fragile thing to be protected rather than a person to be known. She loved them deeply, but their love felt heavy with obligation and pity, not the kind that sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. What Teslyn didn't know was that 30 feet away, standing behind a newspaper he wasn't actually reading, 33-year-old Weston Aldrich had been watching her every Thursday for the past 6 weeks. Not in a creepy way, though he worried it might seem that way, but with the kind of desperate hope that comes from recognizing someone you thought you'd lost forever. Weston had been a senior when Teslyn was a freshman at Ridgemont University. He'd noticed her immediately, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the way she'd laugh in the campus coffee shop, throwing her whole heart into it, or how she'd sketch during lectures, completely absorbed. He'd been too intimidated by his own feelings and the age gap to approach her then, convincing himself there'd be time after he graduated and established himself. Then she'd disappeared from campus. He'd heard rumors about an accident, a withdrawal, but by then he was building his tech startup from nothing, working 100-hour weeks. By the time his company became successful, worth millions now, he'd assumed she'd moved on with her life, probably married, probably happy. Until 6 weeks ago, when he'd seen her by this fountain, and his heart had recognized her instantly despite the years and the wheelchair and the sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He'd been coming every Thursday since, trying to work up the courage to approach her, terrified of seeming like a stranger with suspicious motives, paralyzed by the fear that she wouldn't remember him at all. Today, watching her sketch with such focused intensity, Weston made a decision. He couldn't keep lurking like some ghost from her past, but a direct approach felt too invasive, too much. So he did something that felt both cowardly and sincere. He wrote a note. On expensive cardstock he'd brought specifically for this purpose, he wrote carefully, "I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. You used to sit in the corner of Morrison Hall sketching during Professor Parker's lectures. Your laugh could light up the entire coffee shop. I was too scared to tell you then that I thought you were remarkable, not because of how you looked, but because of how you saw the world. I see you're still creating art, still finding beauty. That takes more courage than I've ever had. If you ever want company by this fountain, I'll be at the coffee cart tomorrow at 3 p.m. If not, I understand, but I wanted you to know. Someone sees you, really sees you. W." He waited until Teslyn was absorbed in her drawing, then quietly placed the folded note beside her wheelchair and walked away before courage could fail him completely. Teslyn found the note 20 minutes after she was packing up. Her hands shook as she read it once, twice, 3 times. Morrison Hall, Professor Parker, the coffee shop. These weren't vague pleasantries. This person actually remembered her from before, from when she'd been whole and hopeful and unbroken. But who was W? She'd known dozens of people at Ridgemont, though most had faded from her life after the accident. The few who'd reached out initially had eventually stopped when she'd been too depressed to respond, too ashamed of her new reality to let them see her diminished. That night, Teslin barely slept, the note folded carefully in her sketchbook, reading it over and over. Part of her wanted to ignore it. Whoever this person was, they remembered the old Teslin, and she wasn't that girl anymore. But another part, the part that still sketched and came to this fountain chasing her mother's memory, whispered that maybe being remembered was exactly what she needed. The next day, at 2:45 p.m., Teslin sat by the fountain, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. She'd almost turned back 3 times, convinced this was a mistake, that disappointment was inevitable. At exactly 3 p.m., Weston approached the coffee cart, ordered 2 lattes, and then turned, seeing her there. For a moment they just stared at each other, recognition flickering in Teslin's eyes, confusion, then slow dawning memory. "Weston Aldrich," you said. You were in advanced programming. You helped organize that charity hackathon my freshman year. "You remember," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he approached carefully, offering her one of the lattes. "I remember you were kind," Teslin said softly. "You treated the freshmen like equals, not nuisances. I remember thinking I hoped I'd run into you someday." They sat together, Weston on the bench, Teslin in her chair, and talked for 3 hours. He told her about building his company, about the success that felt hollow without meaningful connection, about seeing her that first Thursday and feeling like he'd been given a second chance at something he'd been too afraid to pursue years ago.
Teslin told him about the accident, about dropping out, about the slow, painful process of learning to live in a body that no longer worked the way it once had, about her art becoming both salvation and prison, the only place she still felt like herself. "Can I see?" Weston asked gently, gesturing to her sketchbook. Teslin hesitated, then opened it. The drawings were extraordinary, raw, emotional, capturing moments of beauty and pain with equal honesty. Weston paged through them reverently. "These are remarkable, Tess. Have you shown them anywhere?" "Who would want to see them?" she asked, the question holding years of accumulated rejection and self-doubt. "Everyone," Weston said simply. "These make people feel something real. That's rare." Over the following months, something unexpected bloomed between them. Weston didn't treat Teslin like she was broken or fragile. He challenged her art, encouraged her growth, and most importantly, he was simply present, showing up every week, rain or shine, building trust through consistent kindness. What Teslin eventually learned, what Weston finally confessed during a particularly vulnerable conversation, was that he'd been in love with her since that first year at Ridgemont. He'd spent years building his success, partly hoping to become someone worthy of approaching her, only to discover she'd been dealing with challenges that made his corporate achievements feel trivial. "I don't need you to be successful or impressive," Teslin told him, tears in her eyes. "I just need you to keep seeing me the way you do, like I'm still whole, even though everything feels broken." "You are whole," said Weston firmly. "Teslin, you're one of the most complete people I've ever known. Your wheelchair doesn't define you. Your courage, your art, your heart, that's who you are." The revelation that Weston had harbored feelings for her all these years was overwhelming, but Teslin realized she'd been falling for him too, not the successful CEO, but the man who wrote her notes and brought her coffee and sat with her by the fountain, listening to the water remember wishes. 8 months after that first note, Weston helped Teslin organize her first art exhibition. He provided the gallery space, a beautiful, fully accessible venue, but insisted the work speak for itself. The opening night was packed with collectors, critics, and ordinary people moved by the emotional depth of Teslin's pieces. Her father and grandmother attended, seeing their daughter not as someone to protect, but as an artist in her own right. and Weston stood in the back, watching Teslin glow with pride and purpose, knowing he'd been given the extraordinary gift of loving someone who taught him that wholeness has nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with authenticity. As the evening wound down, Teslin found Weston by the window. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the note, for showing up, for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," replied Weston. "You taught me that the bravest thing we can do is keep showing up for the people who matter, even when we're terrified, especially then." Teslin reached for his hand. "Mom used to say the water remembers every wish. I think maybe one of mine finally came true." Because kindness is often quiet, a note left on a bench, consistent presence, seeing someone's humanity when the world sees only their limitations. It's showing up week after week, building trust through small acts of care, believing in someone's worth even when they've forgotten it themselves. And sometimes that quiet kindness becomes the foundation for something extraordinary. Not perfect, but real, built on the simple truth that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and loved exactly as they are.
If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.